We'll look now at some of the tools you get in a typical PC toolkit. We'll start by looking at the drivers. This first driver we'll take a look at is known as a Torx driver. We look at the shape of the head. You see it's a star shape. And manufacturers such as Hewlett-Packard and Compaq use a lot of these types of screws with a star-shaped head in them, holding the lid onto the system case and holding the power supply unit in place and so on. So that's a very useful type of driver to have in your toolkit. That's a Torx driver. Most systems though don't use Torx screws, they use standard Phillips screws. So you can see this is a typical sort of screw we find in the system, holding the lid on, holding the power supply unit in place, holding interface cards onto the system case. As well as having a Phillips head, it also has a hexagonal shaped head as well. So we can tighten these screws up or loosen them either using a standard Phillips driver. You normally get a couple of sizes of those in your toolkit. That's pretty straightforward. But personally, I prefer to use a hex driver with these sorts of screws. It's a 1/4 inch hex driver. That's the size typically of system case screws. And you can see that fits very securely over the screw, holds it in place much better. Get a much better purchase, a much better grip on that. And typically you get a couple of sizes of those in your toolkit as well. This is a very useful tool. This is called a parts retriever. It has a plunger at one end. When you press down the plunger, you see some metal prongs come out of the other end. Now that can be very useful if you drop a small piece, a small component like a screw, in the system case and it lands somewhere inaccessible, like between two interface cards. You can simply press the plunger down. And there you go, grab hold of the part that you can't get to with your fingers. Sometimes I also use these to actually start screws off. Just putting the screw into the parts retriever now. There, so if you grip the screw like so with your parts retriever, you can now start threading the screw in. That's very useful where you're trying to put screws in horizontally. So that's our parts retriever, very useful little tool. An alternative parts retriever is simply a pair of tweezers. Last but by no means least, we have here a tube with a secure lid, which is very useful for keeping small parts in while they're not being used, like spare screws, jumpers, motherboard standoffs and so on. And a typical toolkit will normally come with a nice little zip-up case with little elastic bands to keep all of your tools in place.